Still gripping the pie I baked for my late son's daughter, I watched his widow laugh at the head of my table. As their forks clinked against plates I once picked out, they didn't even glance my way. While the scent of roasted turkey filled the house I helped them buy, I realized I'd become a guest in my own bloodline. The same woman who married my son now acts like she inherited me, too. That's when it clicked. I didn't lose a family. I financed a takeover. So I wrote a check and took back the deed. Quietly. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Joyce's car, a weathered sedan, pulled into the driveway as it always did. Quiet, almost unnoticed. The same pecan pie, golden brown and glistening with syrup, sat in the passenger seat, nestled into its old, familiar carrier. It had become a tradition, one she'd kept up even after the loss of her son. She wasn't sure if they appreciated it, but she made it anyway. It was the least she could do. Every year, the pie was her offering, a little piece of comfort from the woman they no longer wanted in their lives. She stepped out, the crisp November air biting at her cheeks, and adjusted her cardigan, a soft, worn-out piece that had seen more family dinners than it should have. Her eyes scanned the house in front of her, Chloe's house, though it never really felt like it. It had been a house for Ryan and Joyce's son, their last connection to their old life. The house still had echoes of him in the walls, in the pictures on the mantel, in the room where his daughter now slept. Chloe appeared at the front door, her smile tight, strained like it always was when Joyce came around. There was no warmth in it, not anymore. "Hi, Joyce," Chloe said, her voice just a little too bright, a little too forced. Joyce nodded, stepping forward and holding out the pie as she had done every year. Pecan pie, like always. Chloe's eyes flickered down at it for a brief moment before she extended her hands to take the offering, but didn't comment on it. She gave a polite but clearly practiced smile. "Thanks," she said flatly, then turned and stepped aside, ushering Joyce inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the tension of the day seemed to settle onto Joyce's shoulders. Chloe was wearing her usual uniform of a carefully chosen blouse, unscathed by the discomfort that now clung to everything about their relationship. As Joyce stepped into the hallway, she heard laughter spilling from the living room, light and distant. The smell of roasted turkey and mashed potatoes filled the air, the same smells that had been present at every holiday dinner for as long as Joyce could remember. But today, it felt different. She turned the corner, and her gaze fell on the sight that made her stomach tighten. A second dining table, set up in the living room. It was just off to the side, surrounded by mismatched chairs, as if the dining room itself wasn't enough. This table, Joyce realized, was for the overflow. She could almost feel the distance between herself and the others, even before Chloe's words confirmed it. "We're keeping this one for immediate family," Chloe said casually, as if Joyce wouldn't understand the quiet dismissal laced in the words. Joyce nodded slowly, biting back the words that rose to the surface, words that would have been so easy to say, words that might have changed things, might have ended this particular charade. But she held them in, forcing a smile as she set the pie down on the kitchen counter. "Of course," Joyce said, her voice even, betraying nothing. She was used to this now. It wasn't the first time they'd done this. Treated her like she was someone who no longer belonged, someone whose presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. But this time, there was something different in the air. A subtle shift. The dinner proceeded, loud and full of energy, as Chloe moved between the two tables with ease. Joyce couldn't help but notice how easily she navigated the room, how the younger people at the table leaned in toward her, laughing at her jokes, hanging on her every word. They didn't need to ask. Chloe had the space now, the space that had once been Joyce's, back when their son was alive, back when there had been unity in the house. Joyce kept her eyes on the pie, the one she had brought with such care, the one she knew no one would touch at the family table. She could feel her chest tightening, but she stayed still. Her hands were steady as she wiped a spot of flour from her cardigan. No one else noticed, or if they did, they didn't care. Later, after the meal had settled into an awkward lull, Joyce heard the whispered words, too quiet to be meant for anyone other than her. "She doesn't belong at the table anymore." Chloe's voice, thin and sharp, cut through the noise. Joyce didn't turn to look, didn't acknowledge the comment aloud, but the words stung like salt on an old wound. They'd never outright said it before, but she had always felt it. Their quiet exclusion, their unspoken belief that she had no place among them anymore. Joyce swallowed, her throat tight, and took a long breath. She stayed in her seat, her fingers curled tightly around the edges of her plate, the clink of silverware on porcelain louder now than the conversations around her. For a long moment she let the words hang in the air, thick and heavy. She had heard them clearly enough. She didn't belong at the table, but what if she didn't need to? The thought hit her like a sudden cold gust of wind. She could feel the weight of it, of what she was about to do, but she didn't flinch. She smiled, nodding to herself quietly. She wouldn't argue, wouldn't fight. No, she would simply leave, but she wouldn't leave, empty-handed. As Joyce stood, her legs slow but steady, her hand brushed against the edge of the table. For a second it felt like she was anchoring herself, like the table had been her support for so long. She didn't look at Chloe or the others. She didn't need to. Her decision had already been made. She turned and walked toward the door. The last echo of the door closing behind Joyce lingered in the air. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, as she made her way to the car, clutching the worn leather strap of her purse with a kind of finality. The cool evening wrapped around her like an old, familiar blanket, but something was off. She felt the weight of it settle in her chest, the quiet sting of being dismissed. She started the engine, the hum of the car soothing, almost rhythmic, as she drove away from Chloe's house. A wave of sadness washed over her, but it wasn't for the pie left uneaten, nor the empty seat at the table. It was something deeper, something more rooted in years of unspoken tension. A bitter realization that had quietly shifted from a minor irritation into something unshakable. It wasn't the first time she'd been made to feel like an outsider, but this time she understood that the story had changed. Chloe's family had moved past her. It wasn't just the dinner, it was the house. The home that had once been hers, that she had helped her son buy. That house, she realized, was never really meant to be Chloe's forever home. The next morning, after a long, sleepless night, Joyce sat at her kitchen table. The sun filtered through the half-drawn blinds, casting shadows that felt like the weight of old memories. The pie from the previous evening, now covered in plastic wrap, sat on the counter like an abandoned relic of a failed tradition. She sipped her coffee and dialed Janine's number, the phone vibrating against the smooth surface of the table. The call rang once, twice, and then Janine picked up, her brisk tone almost as sharp as Joyce had expected. "Joyce, good morning. You're up early." "I need a favor," Joyce said, her voice steady, controlled. She had done this before. She had always been the one to manage, the one to find a way when things seemed out of place. "Is 14 Cedar still on the owner's hold list?" There was a pause on the other end, a brief hesitation. Joyce could almost hear the wheels turning in Janine's mind, the broker's instinct already at work. "Wait, you're not thinking about—" "Just tell me," Joyce interrupted, her words firm. "It's still there," Janine replied after a moment, a bit more cautious now. "But Joyce, you know that house. It's been on hold for a reason. The owner, well, he's not exactly in a hurry to sell. He's been renting it out, month to month. I don't think Chloe knows that the lease is up, but is there a reason I shouldn't buy it? Joyce asked, cutting her off before she could go any further. Janine was silent for a beat longer than Joyce would have liked, but then, with a resigned sigh, she said, "No, I suppose there's not. It's not a complicated deal, just, you're sure?" Joyce didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." She ended the call without another word. The decision had been made. In a few days, she would own the house that had once been a home for her son, and now a place Chloe had claimed as her own. But it was never meant to be Chloe's, not in the way she thought. The house was just another piece of the puzzle, another way Joyce would reclaim what had been taken from her. Later that afternoon, Joyce stood in front of 14 Cedar. The house looked unchanged from the outside, neatly trimmed bushes, the same porch swing swaying in the breeze, and the kind of stately charm that only an old money neighborhood could provide. There was something comforting about it, the heavy, weathered wood of the front door. The tall windows that seemed to look down at her as if the house itself remembered the past. It was hers now. Well, it would be. Once the paperwork was done. Joyce's fingers hovered over the doorbell, and for a moment, she considered stopping by to let Chloe know what was coming, to see the look on her face when she realized what had just happened. But then Joyce exhaled, a soft sound, almost like a laugh. There was no need for that. She had already made her statement. There would be no confrontation, no grand reveal. It was more satisfying this way. A few days later, Joyce received the deed to the house in the mail. She turned it over in her hands, the papers crisp and official. The name of the previous owner, a faceless stranger, still stamped on the top. But beneath that, her name. She drove by the house again, just to be sure. But there was no change, no signs of movement. Chloe hadn't yet realized what had happened. Joyce couldn't help the small smile that curled at the corner of her lips. The next step was clear. Joyce wasn't done. And when the time was right, Chloe would learn exactly who had the power now. The cafe was small, tucked away on a quiet corner of Asheville's bustling downtown, a place where the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the faint smell of old books from the adjoining bookstore. Joyce liked it here, away from the noise, from the world she knew was growing more distant by the day. She arrived early, as always, and found herself seated at the corner table by the window, her hands folded neatly on the smooth, worn wood. Her coat hung over the back of the chair, and she briefly touched the folded edges of the fabric, as if it held some semblance of order in a world that was anything but. Janine walked in exactly on time, her sharp heels clicking against the floor with a precision that could almost be heard from the parking lot. Joyce watched her approach, straight-backed, her eyes already scanning the room, calculating, assessing. Janine was a woman who didn't waste time, and Joyce liked that about her. She slid into the chair across from Joyce without any unnecessary pleasantries. "Here's what you asked for," Janine said, pulling a folder from her leather bag and setting it down with a quiet thud. She opened it, revealing a stack of papers, comps, market trends, comparable sales from the area. Joyce picked up a paper and scanned the numbers with a practiced eye. The figures didn't surprise her. 14 Cedar was a beautiful house, prime property, and the market was shifting. Chloe's dream had always been an illusion, one Joyce was prepared to dismantle piece by piece. "I want it quiet," Joyce said, looking over the top of her glasses. Her voice was low but certain. "Fast. Clean." Janine nodded, the tiniest flicker of approval in her eyes. "Of course, we'll move before the listing even hits the market. No announcements, no drama, just business." Joyce gave a slight nod in return. This wasn't about making a scene. This was about control. About taking back what had been taken from her. She shifted in her seat and placed the comps back on the table, her fingers lightly brushing over the top of them before pulling them back. I don't want a lot of back and forth. I'll offer full asking price. No negotiations. It's clean. Janine blinked, her gaze flickering between Joyce's face and the papers in front of her. Wait, you're telling me you want to pay full price? No discounts? Not even a little? Joyce's lips parted into a thin, controlled smile. What else? The shock registered for only a brief moment, but it was enough for Joyce to feel the small rush of satisfaction that came with taking the reins. Janine, the expert, the one who usually controlled the negotiations, was momentarily thrown off balance. But Joyce wasn't here to haggle. She had something Janine didn't: the means to make a clean offer, and the quiet certainty that it was her time. Janine straightened in her chair, then chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. I should have known. This isn't about getting a deal. This is about making sure no one else gets what you want. Exactly, Joyce said, her voice quiet but firm. I want that house, and I'll get it. There was a flicker of understanding in Janine's eyes now, something that told Joyce they weren't just talking about property anymore. They were talking about something deeper, something that ran much closer to the bone. Janine flipped through the papers, glancing over the details with a sort of practiced nonchalance, but Joyce knew better. She knew the game now. She had played it for years. She'd spent enough time watching the world from the periphery to understand how it moved, how it swayed, and how to make it bend. You're sure about this, Joyce? It's not a typical transaction. It's personal. Joyce smiled again, a sharp, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It's not personal, she said, her voice colder than before. It's just business. Janine nodded, as if she understood that better than anyone. There was a silence between them now, a brief moment where they both understood the weight of what was happening. A deal was being made, not just for property, but for something else, something that only Joyce truly grasped. I'll arrange everything, Janine said finally, tapping the papers back into a neat stack and slipping them into her bag. I'll make sure this goes smoothly. You'll have your house. I already have it, Joyce replied, her eyes cold and steady as she rose from the table. I'm just waiting for the papers. As Joyce left the cafe, a breeze swept through the door behind her, cool and biting against her skin. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her steps were sure, as if the path ahead was already laid out, smooth and clear. She glanced back at the cafe's window one last time. Janine sat there, her coffee long forgotten, already making the calls that would solidify Joyce's quiet victory. Joyce's hand lingered near the keys in her purse and her lips curled into the smallest of smiles. When Chloe found out, she would realize that nothing, not her protests, not her hope, not even the house itself, could stop what Joyce had set in motion. The game was just beginning. The signed contract was simple, clear, final. Joyce held the papers in her hands, feeling the weight of them more profoundly than she expected. She had read each line carefully, every clause, every stipulation. There would be no surprises. The offer was firm, no contingencies. Here's your copy, Janine said, her voice neutral but with an edge of professional pride as she slid the document across the table. The ink on the paper was still fresh, a tangible testament to Joyce's quiet victory. Joyce studied the signature lines. It wasn't much of a contract, not really. It was a transaction, a smooth, businesslike exchange, but it was hers now. She had closed the deal before it ever had the chance to make headlines. I'm waiving inspection, Joyce said, her voice low but resolute, like it had been set in stone long before the words left her lips. Janine's brows arched slightly, a brief flicker of surprise in her gaze. No inspection? You're sure? Joyce didn't flinch. They won't even know until it closes, she said flatly, her eyes steady as she scanned the document one last time. There was no need for it now. The house was already hers. The details almost irrelevant in the grander scheme. Janine leaned back, folding her arms. A bold move. I like it. You're not wasting time. I don't have time to waste, Joyce replied, the edge of her voice now matching the sharpness in Janine's. And I don't need their approval. The transaction was sealed, quietly, swiftly, and soon it would be done. Joyce had paid in full, her antique store exit sale funding the entirety of it. The years of collecting, the years of carefully curated items, were finally put to use. Her assets had always been more than just a means of income. They were her quiet rebellion, her way of holding on to what was hers in a world that wanted to strip it all away. The antique store had been her world for decades, a legacy of her late husband's passion for fine furnishings and rare finds. And now, with the house purchase complete, Joyce was using that world to take back what had once been hers, and never truly lost, despite what they thought. Done, Joyce said, standing up from the table and slipping the signed documents into her leather bag. Make sure the transfer is smooth. Janine's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, but she said nothing else. There was an understanding now, silent, but complete. They were done with the pleasantries. A few days later, Joyce drove by 14 Cedar again. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just the familiar scene. The house loomed in front of her, untouched and pristine. Chloe had hung new curtains in the front windows. Light, airy fabric that made the house look even more like a home. It was a facade, one Joyce had seen before, but now it didn't feel like a home at all. It felt temporary. It had always been temporary, despite the careful facade Chloe had crafted. Joyce parked across the street, hidden behind the trees that lined the edge of the property. She watched as Chloe moved through the house, adjusting the curtains with an air of pride. It didn't matter. None of it did. The house would soon be hers in ways Chloe couldn't even begin to understand. For a long moment, Joyce sat still, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her gaze unwavering. The street was quiet. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows on the lawn. It felt like an inevitability, like the world was lining up the pieces, one by one, to set things right. She drove off without a word, without a glance back. Later that evening, Joyce sat in her living room, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator in the next room. The paperwork sat on the table in front of her, a final formality. The deed to 14 Cedar, stamped with the official seal of the county clerk, was folded neatly in the folder. Harlan arrived as the sky darkened outside. He knocked once before entering, a knowing smile on his face. The man had been her late husband's closest friend and confidant, and had known Joyce long enough to see when she was about to make her move. "Cold move," Harlan said, glancing at the papers spread before Joyce. "I like it." Joyce looked up from the folder, her fingers grazing the edge of the document. She could feel the cool weight of her decision, but it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like something else entirely. "It's not revenge," she said, her voice calm and measured. "It's a return on investment." Harlan raised an eyebrow, leaning against the back of the chair. "Investing in what?" "Control," Joyce replied. She gave him a long, knowing look. "And peace." Harlan chuckled softly, his smile more genuine now. "You've been planning this for a while, haven't you?" Joyce didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. She had been planning this for years, quietly, steadily. Every action, every piece of the puzzle, had led her here. "There's nothing left to plan," Joyce said softly, pushing the papers aside. "It's done." And yet, as she looked at the folded deed, the finality of it still felt like a moment suspended in time, waiting for the inevitable end to arrive. The next day, Chloe would receive the official notice, though she wouldn't understand it at first. And when she did, when she finally realized what had happened, she would learn that Joyce had never really left the table. She had simply bought it. And soon, everything would change. The deed arrived at Joyce's house like a final, inevitable punctuation mark. Wrapped in the thick envelope, sealed tight with an official county stamp, it felt heavier than it should have. She held it in her hands, the crisp edges pressing against her palms, as if the weight of the paper itself could anchor her in this new reality. The doorbell rang as she stood there, staring at the envelope. Joyce didn't flinch, didn't rush. She already knew who it was. Janine, punctual as ever, carrying the last of the paperwork. She let the moment linger, the quiet finality of it all. This was it. There was no going back now. She opened the door and Janine stepped inside, holding a folder neatly tucked under her arm. The sharp smell of her perfume filled the air, but Joyce barely noticed. She was focused on the envelope, her mind running over everything that had led her to this moment. "Here it is," Janine said, her voice steady but tinged with the satisfaction of completing the deal. "The title history. Clean. Everything's in order." Joyce set the envelope down on the kitchen counter and opened it slowly. She didn't need to read the title again. She already knew the details, the deed, the papers, all of it. But there was something about seeing it in her hands that gave it weight, something that grounded her in this quiet victory. Janine flipped open the folder, glancing at the page. "As you can see, it's all been transferred. Yours now. You're officially the owner of 14 Cedar. There's no turning back." Joyce didn't reply. She ran her fingers over the title, letting the cold, crisp edges of the document brush against her skin. "Funny," Joyce said finally, her voice quiet. "His name used to be on here." Janine paused, her brow furrowing slightly. "You mean your late husband?" Joyce nodded, her eyes distant. She could almost hear his voice, feel the weight of his presence in the house that now belonged to her. The house that had once been part of their life, before everything had changed, before everything had unraveled. "I thought about it," Joyce continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He never would have let things go this far. But then, it's funny what happens when the world pushes you out of your own space. You find ways to make it yours again." Janine didn't speak. She didn't need to. She was a professional, but she understood the undercurrent of what Joyce was saying. She understood that this wasn't just about the house anymore. It wasn't even about Chloe. Joyce had never truly left the table. She had just been waiting for the right moment to take control again. And now, here she was, holding the deed to the house, the one place that had slipped through her fingers years ago. "I'll file this with the county myself," Joyce said, her voice firm as she folded the documents neatly into the folder. Janine gave a slight nod, her face unreadable, but there was a flicker of respect in her eyes now. She knew better than to say anything more. This was more than a business transaction for Joyce. It had always been more. By the time Joyce reached the county office, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the streets. She stood in line, her folder in hand, waiting as others passed by, their voices indistinct murmurs in the background. When her turn finally came, the clerk behind the counter barely looked up as she slid the papers across the desk. "Filing this with the county," Joyce said, her voice polite but unmistakably final. The clerk nodded without a word, stamping the papers with the official seal. Joyce signed off, collected her copy, and left the office without a second glance. That evening, as she drove home, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen was familiar. Carter Wells, the HOA board member who had always been a fixture of the neighborhood's politics. Joyce's hand hovered over the phone for a moment before she answered. She knew what this was about. "Ms. Stratton." Carter's voice was gruff but polite. Welcome back to the neighborhood. Joyce's lips curled into a small, tight smile. Thank you, Carter, she said, her voice calm, like they were merely talking about a neighborly matter, like the air was warm and inviting instead of thick with the weight of everything that had been set in motion. I've updated the records, Carter continued, oblivious to the power dynamics shifting behind the polite conversation. The address is all set. Your place in the neighborhood is officially restored. Joyce sat back in her chair, her fingers wrapped around the phone, the coolness of the plastic casing grounding her. The house was hers, fully and completely. And now, she was here to stay. Not just in the physical sense, in every other sense that mattered. Good, Joyce said simply, the word carrying a finality that lingered in the air long after the conversation had ended. Later that night, she sat on her front porch, the soft evening breeze rustling the trees around her. Her hand reached for the old, weathered mailbox key, the one she hadn't touched in years. She stood, walked to the mailbox and inserted the key into the lock. It clicked open with a familiar sound. Joyce smiled faintly as she turned the key and pulled the door open, the quiet satisfaction of knowing the house was truly, completely hers, settling in her chest. She had taken everything back. And now she would watch as it all unfolded. The next steps were clear. But first, she would enjoy the peace that would be hers, forever. Joyce sat at her kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background and the faint smell of coffee still lingering in the air. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound her pen scratching across the lined paper. She had drafted it carefully, word by word, her fingers moving with precision. Every letter had to be just right. The termination letter was simple, just like the transaction that had led up to it. A formality. Nothing emotional. Just business. She'd already secured her position, signed the paperwork, and taken control. The final step was this. Chloe would have to read it, sign for it, and understand the message in black and white. She finished writing the letter with a calm, almost surgical detachment. The words were straightforward, but the message would be clear. Effective immediately, your tenancy will not be renewed. Joyce slid the letter into an envelope, taking her time. There was no need to rush. This would be the finishing touch. The final blow. She sealed the envelope carefully, ensuring it was airtight, then addressed it to Chloe at 14 Cedar. Her fingers trembled just slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of what was about to unfold. The next morning, Joyce walked into the post office and handed the envelope to the clerk. She requested the certified mail option, the one that required a signature on receipt. It wasn't just a formality for her. It was a statement. Chloe would have no choice but to acknowledge this. No choice but to understand exactly who had control now. Joyce watched the clerk stamp the envelope and slide it into the outgoing pile. She didn't watch for long, though. The deed had already been done. She had done what she needed to. The rest was just waiting. The afternoon passed slowly, but Joyce kept herself busy. She worked around the house, moving with a deliberate slowness, feeling the weight of the silence that filled every corner. Her thoughts occasionally drifted to Chloe, but she pushed them away. She had a plan. This was never about the noise of conflict. This was about control, and Joyce had already taken that back. Hours later, as the sun began to sink low, Joyce received the notification. It was from the post office. Delivery successful. The letter had reached Chloe. The next steps, Joyce knew, would unfold exactly as she'd imagined. Across town, Chloe was in the middle of a long, grueling day of organizing her cluttered life. She had spent the afternoon rearranging her living room, the familiar task of making the house feel like home again. It was supposed to be their forever house, after all. The curtains she'd picked out had just been hung, The last small touch to give the place the feeling of permanence she had wanted. It was almost as if the house was a shield, an attempt to hold on to something, anything that could restore her sense of security. Then, the knock on the door. Chloe wasn't expecting anyone. The envelope was unassuming at first. Just another piece of mail. But there was something about the return address that caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the name. Joyce Stratton. Chloe's brow furrowed. She'd seen that name on so many old family documents, but the realization sent a jolt through her. What the hell was Joyce sending her? Her fingers, unsteady, tore open the envelope. She didn't even think to check the certification until she saw it. Certified return receipt. Her stomach tightened. She unfolded the letter and began reading aloud, her voice trailing off as she got deeper into the text. Effective immediately, your tenancy will not be renewed. The words struck her like a punch. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She read the line again, her mind scrambling for some kind of explanation. But there was no ambiguity in the letter. It was a clean break. Joyce had done it. She had bought the house. She didn't need to understand how or why. It didn't matter. The reality hit her harder than she could have ever anticipated. Her vision blurred, her hands shaking as she read the words again. She thought she must have missed something, some kind of mistake, but there was no mistaking it. She bought the house? Chloe's voice cracked, barely a whisper at first, then louder, her disbelief twisting into rage. She bought the house? The anger boiled up inside her, hot and suffocating, choking her words. Chloe dropped the letter onto the floor, feeling the paper crinkle beneath her fingertips as if it were burning. Her mind raced to make sense of it all. Joyce had done it. She had come back into their lives not just as an outsider, but as the owner, the one who had taken back what had never truly been hers, what had always belonged to her son. Joyce had outplayed her, outmaneuvered her. Chloe's body trembled with the shock, but underneath it, there was a surge of something else, a fierce need to reclaim control, to fight back. But it was too late. The house wasn't just Chloe's anymore, and as she stood there, the letter still on the floor, Chloe realized that she had been completely blindsided. Joyce had played her long game, and now Chloe was the one left with nothing. The next steps were clear for Joyce. For Chloe, though, it was just the beginning of a new war, one she wasn't prepared for. Chloe sat at her kitchen table, the letter from Joyce still on the floor in front of her. Her mind raced, the words of the eviction notice echoing in her skull like a bad dream. Effective immediately, your tenancy will not be renewed. The finality of it settled in like a stone lodged in her throat. She picked up her phone, her hands shaking as she typed the message. She had to let someone know. The shock, the betrayal. It was too much to process on her own. She hit post and leaned back, her gaze still distant, clouded with disbelief. Just got evicted by my late husband's mom. Her fingers hovered over the screen, then she hit send. It felt like she had to make it real somehow, like the words on the screen could somehow wrestle back some semblance of control. She didn't care how it looked. The words were already out there. She could feel the weight of them. Almost immediately, the notifications started rolling in. Sympathy flooded her feed like a tidal wave. People she hadn't spoken to in years weighed in with condolences, comments, messages, likes. They poured in one after another. But as much as it felt good to hear from people who were willing to offer comfort, it didn't touch the sharp sting of what had just happened. And then came the questions. Wait, you were renting? How could Joyce do that? Is she really that cold? What happened to your lease? The flood of sympathy started to feel more like an interrogation, the casual tone of their questions digging deeper into the raw wound that Joyce had just opened. Chloe's stomach twisted as she scrolled through the comments. People were already taking sides, speculating, offering opinions. But the real question was always the same. How could Joyce do this? She didn't know how to answer that. She didn't even know how to process it. Meanwhile, Joyce sat in her own living room, the silence in her house now punctuated only by the occasional sip of tea. She hadn't responded to the messages, to the calls. She didn't need to. She had already won. Chloe's reaction was just the beginning, and Joyce had no intention of stepping into the fray. She had already made her move, and now it was about letting things unfold. The next day, Joyce's attention turned to the house. 14. Cedar still stood, looking pristine from the outside, the new curtains in place, the freshly painted trim giving it a picture-perfect appearance. But Joyce knew it wouldn't stay that way. She had already made arrangements. Harlan pulled up in his truck, his tools in the back, ready to start working. Joyce watched him from her porch, her gaze steady as he began to prepare the house for the listing photos. "I've got everything set," Harlan said, looking over his shoulder. "The exterior needs a little touch-up. I'll get to work on the photos this afternoon." Joyce nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly as she scanned the property. It was more than just prepping for a sale. This was about marking the territory, putting her stamp on the place in every way she could. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about the statement. No one would ever forget who had taken control of 14 Cedar. Chloe's phone buzzed again. Another message. She had been avoiding the calls, but she couldn't ignore the screen this time. She saw Joyce's name on the caller ID. For a moment, she thought about picking up. There were so many things she could say, so many questions she wanted to ask. But she couldn't. Her fingers hovered over the accept button for just a moment longer before she let it go to voicemail. She exhaled, frustration mixing with helplessness. Joyce wasn't going to pick up the phone. Why should she? Joyce had already done what she came to do. She had gotten the house, and now she was sitting back, watching everything unravel. Chloe listened to the voicemail, the sound of Joyce's calm, even voice on the other end only adding to the sense of distance that had grown between them. "Chloe." Joyce's voice was soft, almost too soft, but it carried an unmistakable weight. "I'm not going to discuss this. You know what happened. The house is mine now. You should start looking for a new place to stay." That was all. No apologies. No recognition of the pain she'd caused. Joyce had done what she wanted, and she was done. The voicemail ended, leaving Chloe in the dead silence of her empty home. Chloe stood in the living room, her hands shaking, the phone still in her hand. The calm in Joyce's voice was the hardest part. The way she had stripped everything away, layer by layer, until there was nothing left for Chloe to hold on to. Joyce had played the game perfectly. She had taken everything with quiet precision, and now Chloe was left with nothing but the remnants of a life she thought she had secured. She wanted to scream. She wanted to call Joyce back and demand to know why. Why now? But deep down, Chloe knew the answer. Joyce didn't need to justify her actions. She had already won. As the day wore on, the house outside Chloe's window seemed to change. The paint was drying, the new photos of the house were being taken, and with each passing moment, Joyce was making sure that everyone knew. This was no longer Chloe's home. It was Joyce's, and Chloe was losing more than just a house. She was losing the fight, and she couldn't help but wonder, how far would Joyce go to make sure Chloe never found her footing again? The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long, slanted shadows on the porch, when Joyce heard the sound of tires crunching against gravel. She didn't need to look up. She knew exactly who it was. The steady thrum of the engine grew louder, and then there was the unmistakable squeal of brakes. Ryan. She continued to sip her coffee, her gaze fixed on the house across the street. The house that had been her son's dream, the one Chloe had claimed as her own, but it had never belonged to her. It had always been Joyce's, deep down. She just hadn't had the means to take it back until now. The door creaked open behind her. Ryan's footsteps were hesitant at first, like he wasn't sure how to approach her anymore. But Joyce wasn't worried about that. She knew what this was about. "Mom," Ryan said, his voice tight, careful. "We need to talk." Joyce didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of the conversation hanging in the air, thick with unresolved tension. "I'm listening," she replied, her voice even, as calm as it had been in every other exchange since this whole thing had started. Ryan moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could hear his breath hitch. "We'll buy it. Just name the number." There it was. The offer. The same offer that Chloe had no doubt been whispering about, probably rehearsing it for days in her head. Buy it back. Make it go away. Make it right again. Joyce finally turned to face him, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped slightly as if he were carrying a weight too heavy to bear. She could see the way Chloe's presence, her absence, had shaped him, left him with the need to fix things, to make them whole again. But Joyce wasn't interested in fixing anything. Not now. "No," she said simply, her voice steady and cold. "It's not for sale. Not to you." Ryan blinked, as though he couldn't process what he had just heard. "What?" His voice cracked a little, disbelief creeping in. "Mom, this is ridiculous. Just name the price. I'll pay it. We can fix this." Joyce's smile faded. The satisfaction of the moment wasn't lost on her, but the weight of it was starting to settle. Ryan didn't understand. He couldn't. Not yet. He had spent years avoiding the truth, pretending that everything was fine, that things could go back to how they were before. But Joyce had seen the cracks long before the house came into the equation. She had always known the truth about their son, about Chloe, about how things had shifted once he was gone. "I'm not selling it to you," Joyce repeated, her tone colder now, more final. "I'm giving it to someone who belongs in it." Ryan's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "What does that mean?" His voice was strained, his eyes wide as he searched her face for any sign of softness, of the woman who had once loved him, who had once been part of their family. "You can't do this. You're breaking up Riley's home." The words hit Joyce like a physical blow. Riley, his daughter. Joyce had never once thought about Riley in this whole mess. She hadn't needed to. She wasn't here to punish anyone but Chloe. She wasn't breaking up Riley's home. Riley's home had already been broken, years ago. "You're wrong," Joyce said, her voice clipped, colder than it had been all morning. "I'm not breaking up Riley's home. You did that." Ryan looked as though she had slapped him. His eyes went wide, and for a brief moment Joyce almost saw him as he had been, before grief and time had carved away at the man who had once been so strong. Joyce's gaze softened, but her resolve didn't waver. "I'm just signing the paperwork." She watched him stagger backward a step, confusion and anger mixing in his eyes. He wanted to believe it was temporary, that there was some way back, some way to undo this. But there was no undoing it. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He didn't have a response. He couldn't. The truth was right in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to change it. Silence filled the air between them for a long moment, stretching on as the sun finally dipped lower in the sky, casting shadows over the yard. Ryan stood there, frozen, his shoulders slumped with defeat. And Joyce. Joyce stood tall, firm, the weight of the decision resting comfortably in her bones. "I'm sorry, Mom," Ryan said quietly, his voice hollow. "But this isn't right." Joyce didn't flinch. She hadn't expected him to understand. "It's not about what's right. she said, her words deliberate. It's about what's mine. Ryan swallowed hard, the fight gone out of him. Without another word, he turned and walked away. His footsteps grew quieter with each step, until he was gone, his figure disappearing around the corner of the house. Joyce stood there for a moment, watching the empty street, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. The silence was deep now, but it felt good. The pieces had fallen into place. She wasn't finished. Not yet. But for now, the house was hers. And everything, was finally falling into place. The air was crisp as Joyce moved through the house, quietly, deliberately. The soft creak of her shoes on the wooden floor was the only sound that accompanied her as she made her way to the back guest suite. It had been her son's room once, before the world shifted beneath their feet, before grief and time had eroded everything they had built. Now it was just a space, a room to call her own again. She set down the small bag she'd brought with her, her fingers lingering on the doorframe as she stepped inside. The guest suite was quiet, untouched, as though it had been waiting for this moment. She had been careful not to make any noise. There was no fanfare in her movements. No one was supposed to know she was here yet. She wasn't ready for confrontation, not yet. The room had been rearranged just enough to feel like her own, the scent of fresh linen filling the space. Janine had been the one to help with the redesign, moving pieces, shifting the furniture to fit her needs. Janine had been instrumental in making sure the space felt like it belonged to Joyce, not to anyone else. It was practical, simple, with nothing to draw attention but the heavy, old-fashioned curtains she had chosen herself. The back of the house was hidden from the street. It was the perfect spot for Joyce to settle in quietly, out of sight, out of mind. Chloe and Ryan wouldn't know she was here for a while, not until they got the bill, not until everything was signed and sealed. Joyce sat on the bed for a moment, feeling the weight of her decision settle on her. Riley would be thrilled when she realized Joyce was here to stay, and Riley did, of course, arrive that evening, her small figure bounding through the back door, excitement bright in her eyes. "Mimi, you're staying?" Riley asked, her voice full of wonder. The little girl had always been close to Joyce, even after Ryan and Chloe had tried to shut her out. There was no pretending with Riley. She was too young to understand the intricacies of family politics, but she understood love, and that's what Joyce had to offer. Joyce smiled softly, the tightness in her chest easing for a moment. "I'm staying, Riley, for as long as you need me." Riley ran to her, wrapping her tiny arms around Joyce's waist. Joyce held her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead, but the weight of it all, the finality, the coldness, was still there, pressing down on her like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. A few days later, the changes started to be noticed. Joyce's decision had been made, but there was still work to do. The exterior was already looking different, and now it was time to move inside. Harlan arrived early one morning, a set of tools slung over his shoulder. He had been Joyce's ally through it all, the one person who understood the quiet satisfaction of making a move that no one saw coming. "The locks need changing," he said as soon as he stepped through the door. He went straight for the front door, ready to make sure there were no signs of Chloe or Ryan's ownership left. He didn't need to ask why. Joyce's intent was clear. Joyce stood in the living room, watching him for a moment. She had made sure everything was in place, but the locks, the final safeguard, needed to be reset. They would never have access again, not unless she allowed it. The sense of control was more satisfying than she cared to admit. "I've got it covered," Harlan said, already pulling out the new set of keys. "I'll get it done today." Joyce nodded, and then, with a quiet satisfaction, she made her way to the dining room. The room that had once been a symbol of family unity, now something else entirely. She had made sure everything was perfect. The table was always the centerpiece, always the place where the decisions were made, where they'd gathered for years. She stepped into the room and, without hesitation, lifted the tablecloth. The original dining table, the one that had belonged to her son, the one she had helped pick out, was sitting just where it belonged. No longer the cluttered centerpiece of a broken family, but the rightful place at the heart of the house. She'd asked Harlan to move it back, to restore the space to its original layout. It had always been hers, and now it was back where it belonged. The room felt like a breath of fresh air, like something old and familiar being restored. The heavy, dark wood of the table glistened in the afternoon light as she ran her fingers over the polished surface. This was it. This was the heart of the home. It didn't matter what had come before. She was here now, and this time, things were going to be done her way. Later that evening, as Joyce sat quietly in the dining room, a glass of wine in hand, she watched the sun dip below the horizon. The house felt like a different place now. Quiet, yes, but in a way that felt right. She could hear the faint sound of Riley playing outside, her laughter echoing through the yard, carefree and light. But Chloe and Ryan? They were already gone, already adjusting to the world outside 14 Cedar. The house was hers. And this time, she was going to make sure nothing slipped through her fingers again. She wasn't done yet. But the quiet of the house, the hum of the world outside, made her feel like it was already hers. The battle was over, and Joyce had won. The kitchen felt like a room that had been waiting for its rightful occupant. Joyce stepped in slowly, taking in the familiar surroundings. The space still held traces of Chloe's touch, reminders of the years they had spent here, pretending that everything was as it should be. The magnets on the fridge, little scraps of their old life, had always been a symbol of something fleeting. Clippings, school drawings, reminders of the mundane moments that, at one point, had made them feel like a family. Joyce's fingers brushed the magnets, cool and solid beneath her touch. She could feel the weight of them, the quiet ties that had once bound them together, but now they felt like nothing more than relics of a life that had shifted without her permission. She pulled each one off the refrigerator, one by one, as if removing the last traces of Chloe's influence. She moved with care, but there was a calm finality to her actions. The fridge was soon bare, save for a few smudges where the magnets had once been. The walls felt a little cleaner, a little more hers now. Next, Joyce turned her attention to the farmhouse decor Kendra had brought in, the oversized wooden signs that read, "Bless this mess," and "Home Sweet Home," in overly sentimental fonts. Chloe had been fond of them. Joyce had never been. With deliberate movements, she took them down, feeling the weight of each piece as if it were a physical remnant of someone else's life. She folded the signs neatly, stacked them, and moved them to the donation pile. No more of that clutter, no more pretending. The kitchen felt better already. Cleaner, restored to what it should have been, her space, her home, untouched by the disruptions Chloe had brought into it. She looked around once more, the soft hum of the house filling the air. There was a quiet satisfaction in the space, a calm that had eluded her for years. Later that afternoon, Joyce found herself in Riley's room, a small but bright space that had always felt like a mix of innocence and chaos. Riley had spent most of her childhood here, surrounded by toys, books, and drawings that spoke of a time when the world hadn't yet shattered. Joyce sat on the edge of the bed, watching the little girl draw at her desk, absorbed in the world of her own creation. "Riley," Joyce called softly, and Riley looked up, her face lighting up at the sound of her name. "Can we pick some new colors for your room?" Joyce asked, gesturing to the faded, pale pink walls. Riley's eyes widened, her face filling with excitement. "Can we really? I want it blue, like the sky." Joyce smiled, her heart softening. Blue it is then. They spent the next hour picking out paint swatches, the two of them sitting together on the floor, surrounded by choices. Riley's enthusiasm was contagious, and Joyce found herself lost in the simplicity of it all. It was a kind of peace she hadn't known in a long time. They laughed over the different shades of blue, Riley insisting on the brightest one, and Joyce indulging her with a smile, agreeing to the sky blue she so desperately wanted. Later that night, after the walls had been repainted, Joyce sat at the dining table, her fingers tracing the edge of the placemats. The room was different now, more welcoming, more complete. She had set the table with real plates, none of the mismatched dinnerware they had used for so long. This was a new beginning. The silverware gleamed in the soft light of the chandelier, and the glasses, crystal clear, reflected the calm evening light. This time, it was real. Joyce sat back in her chair for a moment, taking it all in. It felt right. The house was finally what it was meant to be, a place for her, for Riley, for a fresh start. No more shadows of the past, no more memories of Chloe and the life they'd once had. Joyce was finally in control again. She felt it in her bones. As the sun began to set, Joyce heard a knock at the door. She rose, smoothing down the front of her blouse, and opened it to find her neighbors standing on the porch, smiles wide, a freshly baked pie in hand. "It's Apple," one of them said, a friendly grin on her face. "Thought you might like a little something to welcome you back." Joyce's heart swelled with something unfamiliar, a sense of belonging, of being part of something. She took the pie, her fingers brushing against the warm crust, and smiled warmly at the neighbors. "Thank you," Joyce said softly, her voice genuine. "It feels right again." They nodded, their smiles soft and knowing, before they turned to leave, their footsteps light against the porch steps. Joyce closed the door behind them, her heart a little fuller than it had been just moments before. That night, as she sat in the quiet of her living room, the soft sounds of the house settling around her, Joyce thought about everything that had happened. She had made her choices, and now she would reap the rewards. She wasn't just sitting in her home, she was standing in her life, firmly, finally, where she belonged. But there was something more, something she still hadn't finished. Joyce rose from her chair, her fingers tapping the papers on the side table. The will. It needed to be updated, and Riley would get the house one day. Joyce would make sure of that. As the evening stretched on, Joyce made her way to her desk and began to write the necessary changes to her will. She signed her name at the bottom, marking it as the final, unshakable truth. Riley would inherit it all. This house, this life, this future. The house was set. But for Joyce, it was only the beginning. She still had more to do, more to claim. And no one would take it from her again. Not ever. The email from Ryan came the next morning. Joyce sat at her kitchen table, the mug of coffee cradled between her hands, eyes still bleary from a sleepless night filled with too many thoughts, too much quiet. The message was short, clipped, a mirror of the tension that had been hanging between them since the moment she took control. "We need to talk. This can't go on like this. Riley needs both of us. Please, let's fix this." The words hung in the air for a moment before Joyce clicked open her reply. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, her gaze fixed on the bright screen. There was a part of her that felt a stir of guilt, a soft pang of regret for the way things had turned out. But it was fleeting. She had made her decision long ago. She began typing, her fingers moving with quiet precision. "Ryan, I've heard you, and I've listened. You said I didn't belong. I understood." She stared at the words for a moment, her mind circling the past, the years of exclusion, the subtle but clear messages that had come from both him and Chloe, the way they had treated her as an outsider in the very family she had built. But it wasn't their family anymore. It was her life, her house, her decisions. There's nothing left to discuss. It's not my fault you can't accept it. But it's too late for that. She pressed send, her heart steady as the message was delivered, but still not quite free of the weight she'd been carrying. Ryan's call came shortly after, his voice tight, tinged with that same desperation that had become so familiar. "Mom, please," he pleaded. "You're making this worse. We can fix it. I can come by. Let's talk it out. Riley needs both of us." Joyce leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the kitchen window, watching the wind whip the branches of the trees outside. Everything was still, and yet it wasn't. The house felt different now, and so did she. "Too late for that, Ryan," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You made your choice. I'm not the one you need to fix things with." There was silence on the other end of the line. Joyce could almost hear him trying to find the words, his breath steady but unsteady at the same time. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," Joyce added, her tone softening just slightly. "I'm asking you to accept it. This is where I belong now." Ryan didn't respond. Instead, the call ended with the soft click of a hung-up phone. That afternoon, Joyce took the final step in restoring 14 Cedar to its rightful place. Carter from the HOA had been a quiet ally through all of this, and now, with the landscaping plan submitted, she received the final approval she'd been waiting for. It was a simple formality, but the weight of it felt like a seal on the new chapter she was writing. She opened her front door to find him standing there, clipboard in hand. "All set. Looks like the neighborhood's going to be seeing some changes," Carter said with a smile, handing her the signed paperwork. Joyce smiled back, but it wasn't a warm one. It was final. "Good," she said, her gaze shifting toward the freshly cleared garden beds, the carefully manicured lawn that was a stark contrast to the chaos that had lived here before. The space was hers now. And soon, it would be more than just the house. Riley came bounding through the door just as Carter was turning to leave. Joyce watched the little girl run toward her, the air around her lighter, brighter. "Mimi," Riley said, her face radiating joy. "Can we go see the garden? It's all done?" Joyce nodded, bending down to meet her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. It's all ours now." Days passed, and the transformation of the house continued. With each passing moment, Joyce felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Riley was thriving, freer, calmer. She ran around the house with a sense of security Joyce hadn't seen before. There were no longer any whispers in the corners, no more tension hanging in the air. This was her home, and Riley's too. No more hiding, no more pretending. Joyce watched her granddaughter grow, laughing as Riley chased after the small dog they'd adopted, her little feet pattering across the newly manicured lawn. It was a relief, a quiet, lasting relief. But the past wasn't finished with Joyce yet. That night, she sat on the couch with her glass of wine, scrolling through her phone. She had left social media long ago, but Chloe's presence was still there, like a ghost she couldn't shake. Joyce noticed the new notifications, her thumb hovering over the icon. She clicked on the app, and there it was. Chloe had unfriended her on every platform, removed any trace of their connection. It was petty, but it was final. Chloe had erased her from her life as if Joyce never existed at all. Joyce set the phone down without a second thought. It didn't matter. She'd already set the boundary. No more second chances, no more compromises. That evening, as Joyce looked around the house, she felt the peace settle in around her. The boundaries had been set. There was no going back. Chloe, Ryan, they had made their choices. Now, Joyce would make hers. She walked to the kitchen, a smile tugging at her lips as she prepared for dinner. This time, it wasn't just about filling an empty space. It was about claiming it, about setting her own table, one where she belonged. The clink of silverware was the only sound, steady and sure. The table was set, and it was hers. Forever. The doorbell rang softly, interrupting the quiet. Joyce stood still for a moment, then moved toward it. Another step forward, another sign of the world shifting under her feet. But this time, it was her world. The table was set, its surface gleaming under the soft glow of candlelight. Real linens, white and crisp, lay across it, their edges straightened with careful hands. The place settings were simple, but perfect. Everything in its place, just like Joyce had always envisioned. The china gleamed with a quiet dignity, the glassware sparkling in the ambient light. There was no rush, no tension, only a slow, deliberate setting of the scene. Tonight was different. This dinner was a quiet celebration, a thank you of sorts. Not for what had been done for her, but for the new life she had created for herself, and for Riley. The house had been through so much, had been a battleground for years, and now it was a place of peace. Joyce wanted to invite the people who had helped her get here, the ones who understood the value of a well-timed moment. The doorbell rang just as Joyce adjusted the last of the silverware. She moved with a calm, practiced grace, pulling it open to find the familiar faces of her neighbors standing at the threshold, pie in hand, a gesture of friendship. "Come in," Joyce said with a smile, opening the door wider to welcome them in. "It's so good to have you here." The group, a mix of families from down the street and a few teachers from Riley's school, filed in, their faces warm and bright, carrying food, flowers, and laughter with them. The house, which had been so quiet just a few months ago, was now filled with the sounds of life. The clinking of plates, the shuffle of feet, and the soft hum of conversation filled the rooms, chasing away the quiet that had once made Joyce feel like a stranger in her own home. Joyce moved gracefully between the kitchen and the dining room, checking on the food, making sure the wine glasses were filled. She kept her eyes on the table, though, watching as Riley bounded from one guest to another, her small hands gesturing wildly as she recounted a story about school. "You want to sit here, Riley?" one of the teachers asked, motioning to a chair next to her. Riley looked up at Joyce with wide eyes. "Can I?" "Of course," Joyce said, smiling warmly. "Sit wherever you like." There was no set place for anyone tonight. No hierarchy of seating, no unspoken rules about where the important people should sit. For once, everyone had the freedom to take the seat that felt right to them. The table filled quickly, the clatter of chairs adding to the symphony of warmth and life in the room. Joyce stood at the head of the table, the warmth of the candlelight casting a soft glow on her face. As the evening wore on, the laughter grew louder, more comfortable. Stories were swapped between neighbors and teachers, a quiet celebration of the simple joy of community. The moment came, and Riley was the first to rise, her tiny hands holding her glass of apple juice. The room fell into a soft hush, all eyes turning to her as she stood, her face glowing with the kind of innocence that only a child could bring. "To Mimi's house," Riley said, her voice bright and clear. She raised the glass high, the gesture full of meaning, even if she didn't fully understand the weight behind it. Everyone followed suit, raising their glasses of wine, juice, or sparkling water. The room was filled with a silent but profound acknowledgement of what this moment meant. A house, a home, and a future, finally at peace. Joyce smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. She didn't need to say more. The table was set, the wine had been poured, and Riley's toast was the punctuation to it all. The clink of glasses echoed through the room, a sound that felt like an exhale, a letting go of everything that had come before. The house felt full again, not just with people, but with meaning, with a sense of place, of belonging. As the evening wore on, Joyce watched Riley weave between the adults, her laughter light and carefree. The scene felt like something Joyce had once dreamed of but never thought she would have again. There were no more shadows, no more regrets. This was her moment, and she would savor it. The guests slowly began to leave, but not before offering kind words, a final hug, or a promise to return soon. The house was once again quiet, but this time, it felt like the silence was just the calm after a storm, a quiet peace. Joyce lingered in the dining room, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the table. She sat back in her chair, the soft glow of the candles casting a warm light on the evening's success. The house was hers, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she truly belonged here. But as she sat there, the faintest sound of a car engine in the distance made her pause. The shadows outside flickered, and the thought crossed her mind. Was this the end of the story, or was there still more to come? For the first time in a long while, Joyce didn't have an answer. But she was ready for whatever came next. The quiet of the evening was broken by the low hum of an engine, its sound approaching steadily from the street. Joyce looked out the window, her eyes narrowing slightly as the familiar car coasted past, Chloe's. She watched as the car slowed, creeping by 14-seater before picking up speed again and disappearing down the block. It was becoming routine now, Chloe's silent drive-bys. Joyce knew the game, knew the frustration that colored Chloe's movements, the tension that carried her in slow circles around the house Joyce had claimed as her own. It was almost too predictable. Joyce turned away from the window, but the thought lingered. She was no longer surprised by Chloe's actions. What would surprise her, what would truly make a statement, was something else entirely. The next day, Joyce sat with Carter from the HOA, discussing the layout of the neighborhood as if it were any other conversation. He had been a steady presence since she moved in, friendly, but always with a touch of wariness, aware of the shift she'd brought to the street. His eyes flickered over the documents, nodding approvingly at the plans for the landscaping she'd submitted. "You've really done wonders for this place," Carter said, his voice rich with respect. "You're doing more for this street than anyone." Joyce smiled. "It's a work in progress." Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "More like you've turned the whole place around. The yard looks better than I've seen in years." Joyce leaned forward, her fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the table. There was more she had planned, so much more. Later that week, Joyce visited the vacant house across the street. The one that had been sitting, unused and neglected for the past few months. It had always bothered her, the way it sat there, abandoned, as if waiting for someone to claim it. She had the resources, and she had the vision. She bought it in cash, without hesitation. No realtor, no back and forth, just a clean, simple transaction. The house across the street had always been a part of the puzzle, but now, it was her next move. She had already started renovations, transforming the space into a place that would serve a real need, a home for teachers. The local schools had been struggling to find affordable housing for their staff, and Joyce saw an opportunity. She'd turn the house into a rental for local teachers, those who, like her, had roots in this community but didn't quite have the means to buy. It was the kind of stability she could offer them, the kind of stability she had always wanted to give her son, before everything had fallen apart. Joyce stood on the porch, watching as workers began to clear the overgrown yard of the new property. Riley stood beside her, her small hand resting on Joyce's, as they both watched the transformation unfold. "Are you going to paint it?" Riley asked, her voice curious as she looked over at Joyce with wide eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. It'll be a nice place for some of the teachers in the area," Joyce replied, her voice soft, but her gaze steely. "They'll be able to live close to their work, and I'll make sure they have everything they need to settle in." Riley nodded seriously, her little mind processing the weight of the idea. It'll be like a second home. Exactly, Joyce said, a small smile tugging at her lips. A second home. She was still watching the workers when she heard the car again. This time, Chloe's car didn't just pass. It slowed down in front of the new property, coming to a near stop. Joyce's gaze caught Chloe's for a split second. Their eyes locked, the moment too brief for any words, but long enough for Joyce to feel the weight of it. Chloe stared for a long beat before finally driving off, her car pulling away with an odd finality. That night, after dinner, Joyce sat at the desk in her study, a pen in her hand, filling out the paperwork for the new trust. She had been planning this for months, and now it was finally coming together. She smiled softly as she wrote down the name for the second trust, Riley's Row. The name was simple, but it felt right. It was a legacy, a place she could build for Riley's future, a space that would live on long after Joyce was gone. It was hers to shape, and no one would take it from her. Not Chloe, not anyone. She signed the trust with steady hands, sealing it with the certainty of a woman who had fought for everything she now had. Riley's future, her home, her peace. It was all there, in the ink on the page. The property across the street would be the first of many. Joyce leaned back in her chair, the soft sound of the clock ticking in the corner the only noise that filled the room. There were no more whispers, no more doubts. She had made her mark on this place, on this life, and nothing would ever take it away from her. The next morning, as Joyce stood at the window, she saw Chloe's car pass again, but this time, it didn't slow. It drove straight past 14 Cedar, straight past the newly renovated property across the street, as if Chloe had finally accepted the truth. Joyce watched the car disappear into the distance, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the window. A quiet satisfaction settled in her chest. This was the beginning of something new, and it was hers. For the first time, Joyce felt the weight of the future press down on her like a welcome embrace. She was in control, and nothing was going to stop her now. The letter arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, the envelope crinkled, the ink smeared from the dampness. Joyce sat at the kitchen table, her coffee steaming gently in front of her, the house still and quiet around her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't wanted it. But there it was. The unmistakable handwriting that had once been so familiar to her, Chloe's. Joyce hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. She knew what it was before she even opened it. There had been no apology, no sign of remorse before. Just silence, and the cold distance of a relationship long past its prime. She could feel the weight of the paper in her hands, but it wasn't the weight of the words. It was the weight of what it represented. The half-hearted last-ditch effort to restore some semblance of what they had once had. Or, perhaps, what Chloe thought they had. With a steady breath, Joyce tore open the envelope, the familiar rustle of paper filling the stillness of the room. The letter was brief. No grandiose explanations, no flowery apologies, just an acknowledgement that the damage had been done. Dear Joyce, I know things have been hard between us, and I realize now that some of the things I said were hurtful. We didn't mean it like that. I hope you can understand and find it in yourself to forgive us. Chloe Joyce stared at the words for a moment, her eyes scanning the paper but not fully absorbing it. Chloe's apology, if you could even call it that, was thin, too lacking in substance to be anything more than a fragile attempt at mending something broken beyond repair. The absence of real remorse, the lack of an explanation for how they had hurt her, left the words hollow. No, this wasn't an apology. It was an attempt at making Chloe feel better, an attempt to shift the blame without taking responsibility for the actions that had led to this point. Joyce's jaw clenched. She didn't need this letter. She didn't need Chloe to admit what was already obvious. The past couldn't be rewritten. It had been carved into the house, into her heart, into the years they had spent trying to pretend everything was fine. She folded the letter slowly, carefully, as if handling something fragile. The act was methodical, almost mechanical. Joyce didn't let herself dwell on the words. They meant nothing now. Not anymore. She reached for the trash can beside her and dropped the letter in. But she didn't stop there. She stood, walked to the fireplace, and set the crumpled paper alight. The flames devoured it, curling the edges until it was nothing more than ash. The last remnants of Chloe's words faded into the fire, just as Joyce had let go of everything they once shared. Later that day, as Joyce settled back into her favorite chair, she let herself relax, a deep exhale leaving her lips. The tension had lifted. For the first time in a long time, she felt as if the air in her lungs was hers to breathe again. The house felt like it was finally hers. Truly. Completely. It wasn't just a space she occupied, it was a space she had built. It was her peace. Harlan knocked on the door just as she was finishing up in the study. She opened it to find him holding a set of blueprints, his grin as warm as ever. "Got the old antique shop building cleaned up," he said, his voice full of the same quiet confidence he'd always had. "Ready to sell it yet?" Joyce smiled softly, her hand resting against the doorframe. The question was one she had been expecting. The antique shop had been a part of her life for years, a legacy of sorts, both her husband's and hers. But the thought of selling it, of parting with it, still felt like something she wasn't quite ready for. "Not yet," Joyce replied, her voice calm. "Some tables are still worth keeping." Harlan's smile widened, understanding her meaning without needing further explanation. He nodded and handed her the blueprints. "I know you'll know when the time's right." Joyce took the papers, glancing at them briefly before setting them down on the nearby desk. Harlan's respect for her choices was something she valued deeply. He had been with her through all of this, through the chaos, the quiet victories, and the decisions that had shaped this new life. But the shop, the house, both were hers, and both were part of a larger plan, a plan that she would keep close for now. As Harlan left, Joyce stood at the window, looking out over the garden she had designed, the one that had grown into something so much more than she had imagined. The flowers bloomed as they always had, but there was a sense of finality in the air now. The work had been done. The past had been burned away, and Joyce had rebuilt herself from the ashes. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her hand faltered as she reached for the handle. Another visitor? Chloe? No. The knock sounded too firm, too deliberate. With a steady hand, Joyce opened the door. This time, no one was there. But as she looked down at the step, she saw something. A small note, wedged under the door. The handwriting was familiar. Her heart skipped a beat. She bent down, picking it up with slow, deliberate fingers. The note read simply, "We need to talk." And just like that, Joyce felt the weight of everything she had worked for shift again. But this time, she was ready. The house was filled with the quiet hum of preparation. Joyce moved through the rooms with an efficiency that came with years of habit, the soft clink of dishes and the light rustle of cloth guiding her actions. She had set the dining table herself this time. No help, no second guessing. The birthday placemats were laid out in perfect symmetry, 12 in total, each one placed with deliberate care. There was no head of the table this time, no one seat designated for authority, for dominance. The table was set equally, everyone sitting together, shoulder to shoulder. It wasn't about a position of power, it was about unity. For once, there would be no whispers, no tension, no reminders of past fractures. She stepped back and surveyed her work, her fingers trailing across the edges of the placemats, smoothing out the slight creases. The china was set just so, not too formal, but certainly not the mismatched set from before. Real plates. Real glasses. The weight of the good china felt different now, like a statement of what this meal would be. Something earned. Something whole. Riley came running through the kitchen, her small footsteps a reminder of the lightness Joyce had been searching for. She beamed as she entered the dining room, her eyes taking in the full table, her face glowing with a kind of joy that could only come from a child who hadn't yet been burdened by the weight of the world. "Are we having cake?" Riley asked, her voice brimming with excitement as she grabbed Joyce's hand. Joyce smiled, bending down to look her in the eye. "Yes, sweetheart. We're having cake." She paused, her hand brushing Riley's hair back gently. "No casseroles this time." Riley's eyes widened, and for a moment, Joyce saw the glint of relief, the knowledge that this was a celebration, not a forced gathering. It was a real meal, a real family moment, and it was what they deserved. The kitchen smelled of vanilla and buttercream, the cake finished and cooling on the counter. Joyce moved around the space with a steady rhythm, the quiet familiarity of the evening falling over her like a cloak. Riley had already helped set the table, her little fingers eagerly placing silverware beside each plate, her tiny hands brushing against the crisp linens. The joy that had seemed so elusive for so long was here now, settled comfortably into the corners of every room. As the last of the guests arrived, Joyce greeted them with a soft, steady smile, inviting them into the warmth of the dining room. The house felt full again, not just in numbers, but in a way that mattered. It wasn't just about the bodies sitting around the table, it was about what had been rebuilt here, a home, a place where belonging wasn't questioned. The candles were lit, their flickering flames casting soft shadows against the walls. Joyce watched as everyone sat down, the familiar murmur of voices filling the air. No one hesitated this time. There were no awkward pauses, no unspoken tensions. The weight of the past had finally settled, and for the first time in a long time, Joyce felt at ease. She served the cake, the frosting perfect, the layers rich and sweet. And as the slices were passed around, the room filled with a soft clinking of forks against plates. The quiet sound of peace being earned. Riley looked around the table, her face still lit with a smile, her small hand raised high as she called for attention. "To Mimi's house," she declared, her voice bright, strong. The room quieted for a moment, the simple words filling the space with a kind of weightlessness, like the moment was too good to hold on to for long. But it was real. It was happening. The toast was met with laughter and a round of applause. The clink of glasses followed, a soft, ringing affirmation of what had been reclaimed. Joyce didn't say anything after that. She didn't need to. The table was full. The house was full. And for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. The evening passed in a haze of conversation, of stories shared, of quiet laughter that didn't feel forced. The food was finished. The candles burned low, but Joyce lingered at the table, savoring the moment. Riley was now curled up in a chair, her small figure nodding off as the last of the evening's light flickered in from the windows. The silence of the house felt different now. It wasn't an empty silence. It wasn't the heavy kind of silence that had hung over it for so long. This was a silence earned by the weight of a life lived, by the strength to reclaim what was hers. The doorbell rang. Joyce didn't flinch. She knew what it meant. She knew who was standing on the other side. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. She stood, walking toward the door with steady steps, a small, almost knowing smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She opened the door, her eyes steady, her heart even. "They said I didn't belong at the table," Joyce said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet triumph. "So I bought the house it stood in." The silence that followed was thick. Chloe stood there, her expression unreadable, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them, But Joyce? Joyce wasn't afraid anymore.